And I think we're expecting 2 or 3 other people as well. It's good to have everybody here, honestly. Again, it is a crazy day, but I think it's good to remember that regardless of what happens or doesn't happen today, we all have work to do, and we all have work to do where we are in our specific spheres of influence, and where we find ourselves at this moment in history and in this community in Reno Sparks and in our respective organizations. So it's good to just keep plugging away and keep doing what we're doing. And so I'm not sure if anyone else on the call today was with us for our first workshop with Tiffany Young. But Tiffany Young is the Diversity and Equity Director for the Washoe County School District, professor at UNR, just overall superwoman. And she's committed to doing a couple extra credit webinars with us here at the Chamber throughout the fall and winter. So with that, let me go ahead and check to see if we've got other folks. I'm sure there are other folks who are probably just running a little late and will probably hop on later. So maybe Tiffany, if you want to kick us off, and then we'll do your presentation and then do some Q&A at the end.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Tiffany Young, and as mentioned, I wear several hats: Director of Equity and Diversity for Washoe County School District, adjunct professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, and then owner of my own business, Tiffany Young Consulting. And so I'm excited to be with you all today and engage in some opportunity to have some conversation around furthering diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as some topics just around anti-racism. And so I'm very excited to have you to be in front of you today. And thank you, Christine, for entering into this series. So if you want to let me know when you want me to go ahead and share screen, I can do that as well. And then we can kind of move on from there.
All right, anytime you're ready.
All right, I'm ready. So what I have on screen for you all today is just welcome to our Chamber Series session. Again, Tiffany Young Consulting, LLC, and I want to walk you through a couple of slides and then give us an opportunity to have some Q&A. If you have questions in particular that I can answer for you, or just have some open dialogue. One of the things we know is that as we enter work around cultural competency, diversity, equity, inclusion, we think about where we are right now in these very public and present times, is that people are either having some knee-jerk reactions or have had some concerns that they've had for some time and not sure what to do with them. So we struggle with the language that we use or the conversation that we should have. And so we're going to talk about a couple of pieces. So particularly, we know right now that anti-racism has been part of the conversation more and more than ever before. And so there's a couple of points that I'd like you to think about. When people hear the term anti-racism, some shut down, some are a little bit confused. There's mixed messages that are sent back and forth. So there's just 3 points that I want to highlight. The first being, when we think about anti-racism, consider it from this standpoint. There's policy or practice of opposing racism and promoting racial tolerance. So when you think about what's happening in your business or your organization, are you in fact looking at the policies that you've developed? Are you looking at practices in your building that would in fact oppose anything that would harm someone from a different racial group or representation? And so when we talk about promoting racial tolerance, it's more than just tolerating things. It is actually embedding the work of race, diversity, inclusion, equity into practice. So the first step of doing the work of the anti-racism process is examining your policies and your practices that you have in your business. And as you examine those, the work will be to ensure that it's not just a checkbox approach, that you are in fact internalizing this into your practice. The second would be this part of anti-racism conversation is an active and conscious effort to work against like multidimensional aspects of racism. Racism in the conversation of this work is more about a structure than about a person. And so when we get into this dialogue, we get locked into what individuals have done or individual acts, and we don't look at the structure of what's been in place. And so when we are, as a business or organization, actively having conscious effort to work against these things, that means that we're going to dismantle structures that have been in place. some of the good old boy systems that we've had in place, some of the continuing to do things to fit the status quo and not interrupting change. That also means we may be required to let go of some things that we've had held very close to the vest in practice. And so those are some pieces to consider in the anti-racism conversation. The third piece to look at as we talk about anti-racism is really the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And so when you feel a certain reaction rise up, if you look at your business and hiring practices, if you look at the structure and systems that we have in place, that commitment is more than a verbal statement. That commitment is about endurance. And so when people call me oftentimes and they ask, how do I get engaged? How do I get involved? How do we change our practices? My response is, how much are you willing to endure? How long are you willing to stay in the process and the fight? How long are you willing to push up against the system? How much of yourself and energy do you have? So those are three ways to even look at this aspect in this conversation around anti-racism as a structure, okay? So one of the things that's clear to point out, because we get this question all the time, is anti-racism versus allyship. And so businesses and organizations and even individuals have declared themselves allies. And so one of the things I'd like to tell you is to consider some work that comes from both Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi. Ibram Kendi writes, one is expressing the idea that racial groups are equal and none needs developing, and is supporting policy that reduces racial inequality is the work along the lines of anti-racism. So when you are intentionally understanding that there are things that are impacting particular groups of people, it doesn't mean you're owning or claiming responsibility. It means that you're acknowledging these pieces and that you're willing to develop the process to get there. That's the conversation that we have around anti-racism. But then when we talk about this notion of allyship, Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, she refers to racism being created in a vacuum, right? Because we like to think about individual people and about being looked at as someone else's problem. And so she states that racism is a white problem. She speaks about carrying the burden of privilege. And so this act of doing also makes the difference between an ally and an anti-racist. And so when people make these declarative statements, the question is, are you doing the work? And have you in fact asked for permission to be able to engage in this process? So when we talk about anti-racism versus allyship, it's going to be some reflection about where you live in this process and whether or not you've actually gained permission to be an ally in those spaces. Because oftentimes we say I'm an anti-racist, or I'm an ally, but we're not necessarily engaged in populations or the communities that we're supposed to be advocating for. So that anti-racism versus allyship is an open space and opportunity to engage in some powerful reflection, but also be intentional about the path and the process that we engage in. So this systematic change is what we should be seeking. When we think about this work around diversity, equity, inclusion, the process of anti-racism, there are three kind of places that we want to focus on. It's the people, it's the system, and then it becomes the practice. So the people, who is in your organization, your agency, who are you surrounding yourself with? Because the people that we continue to have lived experiences with and connections will feed into whatever narrative we have. They will support your thought process or they will press up against it and cause you to shift and change. So we want to examine, if we're looking for true systematic changes, who are the people that we surround ourselves with? The next is to really have some conversation about the system and what your role is in that system. We know that difference leads to the preferences that we have and who we hire, who we associate with, who we do business with. The preferences that we give based on those differences will then feed the privileges that people hold. And so if we're not doing the work to examine the level of privilege that we have, then we won't know what the power that comes with that does to the people around us. So that system becomes a process. The difference, the preference, the privilege, and then the power is something that we want to look at. And then the last piece would be the practice. There's a link, and I'll share this with Christine and she can send it out, that you can look at resources around anti-racism. You also need to educate yourself. And that means educate yourself on what your lived values and beliefs are, as well as what's happening around society. What's happening today is not new, it's public. What's not happening today is not new, it's present. And it impacts you regardless of how you show up. A business owner, a community person, health care, education, whatever your role is, it will impact you. So educate yourself. The next will be identify the steps to take by talking to people like and unlike you. I've just been talking more and more about being cautious about this social voyeurism. We sit down and talk to someone for their lived experience for that moment, but we don't have any genuine connection with them. So identify and take steps like talking to people that are like you and not like you. And then the third would be to call out racism when you see it and espouse anti-racist ideas to help change racist policies. So we have to understand that when we talk about systematic changes, there is a process that includes the people, it is actually the system, and then we have practices that we need to shift and change. So this work is deep and it's wide, and it takes a lifetime. This work is a journey that we need to enter into. So with that said, we're going to give you time for some questions and answers. So the W there is what do you wonder? What do you want to know? What's still pondering in your mind? Where do you go from here? So that W is an open invitation to a Q&A opportunity.
Nice. I love that. In true fashion, I have about 1 million questions, but I want to make sure that everybody else gets a chance first before I start just shouting things out. So,
Okay.
and again, if you feel comfortable unmuting and starting video, please go ahead. Otherwise, you can always put any questions that you have in the chat box too. That's also an option that's there for you. If you're more comfortable, just put in your question in chat, and then Tiffany and I can see it, and Tiffany can address whatever questions come in. But maybe I'll just kick one off
Okay.
just to get it going. So can you think of any examples? I think we briefly talked about this in the first workshop too, but can you think of any examples of racist policies, like let's say in our employee handbooks, that you've seen firsthand, that you have helped different companies and organizations adapt in order to into making them anti-racist?
So part of the work is examining if your policy is a hindrance or a barrier to someone's success. So if there's a policy that is designed to discuss dress code, for instance, right? So if there is a requirement around the way someone has to wear their hair, or a professional dress, when we use words like professional dress or attitude, those are things that are creating a structure that says, depending on who you are, you may have to change pieces of your identity for you to successfully fit into this organization or fit into this agency. So those are things to consider. I think less and less we have many policies that delineate how a person should dress, but oftentimes it is brought up. And sometimes these things show up as unspoken or unwritten rules. So it may not be written down in policy or practice, but it's implied when you have an interview, or it's implied in meetings, or we use language that others people out of a conversation.
Interesting. Can you think of a recent example? I know you work with a ton of companies.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of a recent example where a company has, let's say they had kind of embedded or coded language in their employee handbook where they made that change? How did they communicate making that change to their employees? And have you seen any results from that, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm seeing it more now. They're shifting in the use of pronouns and documentation, letting employees know that they have that option to put things in their signature, their emails. Also seeing the use of the switching of gender kind of placement about positions. And so oftentimes there is a unconscious continuous process of using he in sentences and statements. And so we have some companies that are changing to say them, they, or their. And so some of those things are occurring. Also, when we use any language that is ascribing to the qualification around like speaking a language. And so now they're saying a way to obtain this position. So there's been some wording and some rephrasing that has occurred.
Gotcha. Um, do you see more of this work needing to be done in around hiring practices, or have you seen a lot of this work needing to be done, once a person gets in the door, or both?
I think both is happening, and more companies are doing blind screening and hiring. We know that there's research that has shown that there have been discriminatory practices in hiring, whether it be conscious or unconscious. And so around any racial or ethnic sounding names for individuals based on ascribing any particular experience that individuals have had on their applications. So if you're not sure about the racial identity of an individual based on their name, if you look through their application and they have experience that's tied to a particular group around race or gender or sexual orientation or socioeconomic status, then people may start to form a perception or a thought about that individual, their skills or their qualifications. So more companies are starting to do some blind screening because there is research that has shown that there has been continual bias in hiring practices. More and more I'm hearing companies say, we really want a more diverse workforce. And so my question to companies is, are you asking for a racially diverse workforce, a gender diverse workforce, a linguistic, like what are we saying? Because we don't explore the dimensions of diversity that exist and have to be reminded that when two people are in a room, you have diversity. Diversity is not a bonus that you get because you are a shade of brown. Diversity you get because you exist. And then there are dimensions to that. So it is a lot of work. And I know that more and more organizations and more companies are intentional about this and wanting to lean into the process, but I think they realize that it is a lot deeper than what they expect. And so when they call and say, we want to do this work, and then we have this dialogue, sometimes there's a, wow, yeah, it's a lot, because if you want to move back past check boxing to systematic changes, that means you have to examine the practice and shift your outcomes.
Gotcha. One question that came to my mind too, especially when it comes to the area of calling out racism. I'm curious to hear what you think about this, because, historically in professional environments, good, bad, or indifferent, the practice is, if you want to make a complaint, you go up to HR and you make your complaint, and then it kind of enters the system or enters the ether, and you don't really know what happens to it after that. I I don't know if I'm sensing this correctly, but I'm getting the sense that, we kind of need to put on our big boy and big girl, pants on, and have more direct conversations when it comes to racism or any kind of discrimination, and calling it out as we see it. What do you think the right approach is? Like, do you think, would you recommend, yes, go through HR systems, but also, yes, have a one-to-one conversation with a person, or with, a supervisor who would be in charge of a particular situation or department? Like, what do you think the best approach is, that one-to-one, or, going to HR to report
So
racism?
what I would say, it's not fair to say what the best approach is, because it depends on the individual. It also depends on the environment in which you work in, and then what you determine is safety for you. So we often hear this conversation about safe spaces, and I'm a proponent of moving from a safe space to a brave space. But that also means that I'm going to have to determine what that means for me, because when you step into this realm of speaking up, you will lose something. whether it's a friend or a job or a colleague or a contract, or, there is potential. And so you have to determine what your level of loss. So when we think about from a business standpoint, what our return on investment is, you're going to have to check your profit and loss statement around diversity, equity, inclusion, and how much are you willing to give up, or what are you willing to sacrifice for the sake of this outcome? That is the discussion of endurance. And so, yes, go to HR. Yes, determine whether or not you can have a teachable moment. Recognize or find allies in that space, or people that can echo what you do. Determine whether or not that person will even hear you, because you have to decide if you're going to get so frustrated that you shut down. And so when you enter into calling this out, the call out is not an attack. We need to be clear about that. The call out is not even a self-righteous opportunity to correct someone. The call out should be considered a teachable opportunity. And so when we're calling someone out, your call out may even be a question where you ask someone to clarify the statement that they just made to better help them hear what they've said. And so you've got to do this work to understand what your level of call out is, and then how much are you willing to endure, right? Because in that process, you are going to lose something. And is it worth it for you? Is some pieces that you need to determine. And I think that businesses are struggling with that right now. Is it worth it for us to press up against the status quo? Is it worth it for us to change this? Do people understand the reason and justification why? But it needs to always be an opportunity to teach, to build, to help people shift their practices.
Absolutely. Absolutely love what you said, moving from a safe space to a brave space. That I think you're 100% right. I think, kind of putting that emphasis on safety is kind of preventing that honest conversation, which which is the bedrock of actually moving forward and understanding other people.
And we need to clarify safe for whom, right? It may be safe for you, but that doesn't mean that it's safe for me. And so if I have a responsibility to fulfill a job or a position that I've been hired to do, and I'm struggling daily with being my true authentic self because the environment has not allowed me to do that, or the system in place presses up against those pieces of my identity, or your policies or your practices are hindering me being my true self and successful in those positions, then it's not a safe space, right? And so we have to do the work to move it into a brave space.
Yeah. How many conversations like this do you feel like you have in a week? Just curious.
All day, every day.
Every day.
It is every single day, and it is exhausting. And so for me, I even, sharing with my team today is that there's a level of self-care for people that lead this work that don't do very well. There are people who have hypertension and stress and have heart attacks and all that things because this work is internalized work. And if you're a leader in this work that believes in it and is genuine about continuing to engage, it is heavy. And so there are some things that we have to do to step back and say, I am not going to allow this to enter this space right now, because I need a moment to check out. So then I can check back in to function. But it is all day, every day.
I believe it. I have kind of I know we're running short on time. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So if there are any questions out there hovering around, this is the time to get them in. But I have kind of a weird question, and hopefully it makes sense. But I mean, you're leading conversations like this all day, every day, 365 days a year. What are the questions you wish people were asking, but they're not asking them?
What is it like for you to have to internalize all of what people are asking? You're right. That would be a great question. I think another question is that I would wish that people have asked is, what do I need to do to examine what I'm doing wrong in order to do right? right? And that doesn't mean that they're a bad person, but sometimes people are saying, what can I do? What should I do? But specifically, what can I do to examine what I'm doing wrong in order to do what I need to do for right is a very intentional question. And the other question is for someone to ask, you know, what might I lose if I do this? Right? Help me consider some things that I might lose, because there is opportunity. We want to ensure that we break down some of the systems that are in place if we're genuine about it. And there is benefit to a diverse workforce, but understanding that diversity has dimensions. And so we want to be better about the language that we use. We want to be better about examining our practices. The dynamics of our communities are changing. We miss out on a lot of skill and intellect and ability for people because they don't fit into the structures of these systems that we put in place. And so we need to be better so that we can have a true diverse community and workforce.
Yeah, agreed. Are there any other burning questions out there? Anybody at all?
I actually did have a question.
Yes.
I am the career transition specialist at Sierra Nevada Job Corps.
Hi.
So part of my job is to guide some of the students who are leaving. I help them find work.
Okay.
So I talk to them about employability skills. Job Corps, of course, basically the whole thing is to prepare them to go out into the workforce or into the military. What are some things that we can talk to them about to promote what you're talking about here? Like maybe tips or things that we can tell them, hey, you know, when you're going into a workplace, like these are the things that you should ask, or these are the things you should look for, or present yourself with. What kind of skills should they have?
That's a great question, Charles. I think one of the most powerful questions that you can give to a young person entering into their career is for them to ask their employer to describe the culture and climate of their organization. Right? There's so much power in an organization's ability to answer that question. How would you describe the culture of the business and the climate of the business? How would you describe how they welcome people that may have a different kind of lived view than the majority of the group that's there? And I think one of the most powerful things you can talk to young people about is understanding who they are as they enter into the workforce. And whether that be around race or culture or language, sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic status, understanding like the pieces of their identity that they're going to bring into their practice every day is going to only help them be stronger in holding on to who they need to be successful in their positions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, it is exactly 12:30 right now, so this is probably a good time to sign off. But again, Tiffany, thank you so much for taking a half an hour out of your very busy day to have just one more of these conversations. And of course, like always, you know, I'll probably post this to YouTube today and get it posted so folks can see it and benefit from your expertise and wisdom. And we'll just keep things moving.
Okay. Thank you so much. Again, thank you to the audience. Thank you, Christine. Thank you to the Chamber for inviting me and having me come. And I'm hoping that people will see from that first session to this session and the sessions to follow that this work is continuous. It is a reminder that it's a journey. And so you may have to start with a checkbox approach to get you in the door or get you out the door, I guess. And then as you start to examine practices, you can only go deeper from there. So thank you for the opportunity to be in front of you. Hope you have a wonderful day.
All right. Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.